Okay, hi everybody. As we start to allow participants in, we'll just wait a couple of minutes for people to join.
And also because this is just like a diversity panel. And one of the things that everyone will get to know about me is I love music. So it won't be that awkward silence. So we're just gonna play a little bit of music, say hello in the chat, just so we can get some good energy going too. So probably just gonna start with some Burna Boy since that's the first thing on my playlist, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Elle and I am the program manager at LA-TechOrg. I first wanted to introduce myself and thank everybody for joining on our important conversation today around honest conversations on diversity and inclusion. This is a really important conversation. We want it to be welcoming and inviting, and we really want to get to the heart of all of the questions that we have received thus far and hear from our amazing panelists. So I just want to thank everybody so much for joining today and being a part of this conversation. I also want to encourage everybody to use the chat box to ask any and all questions you might have. Feel free to send those questions directly to myself or directly to Cole Mora, who we have on today, who is an advisor with LA-Tech.org. We also have Tyler Bell, who is a partner with us through Unite LA, an organization, and he will be moderating today's conversation with our amazing 4 panelists. I would like to thank all of our panelists so much for being a part of the conversation today. And now I'm going to turn it over to my friend Tyler. Oh, Tyler, I think we're on mute.
Yeah, Zoom 101. Take yourself off mute. Thank you so much, Elle, for such a warm introduction. Extremely excited to be with you all today. I have the pleasure of being a part of such an amazing and talented group of panelists. And so again, we want to thank you because you all, each of you have been doing this work tirelessly. And I promise you that this would not just be another conversation around DEI where people don't walk away with something. And so to all of our participants who've joined the call, please use this opportunity to get insights and ask questions from some of the leading experts in this field. So I'll just do a really brief introduction of our panelists today, starting with Lindsay Heiser, who is the Philanthropy Program Manager at Snap Inc. Thank you for joining us. We also have Kathleen Brown, who is a consultant at Adobe. Thank you for joining us. We have Maurice Wilkins, who's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advocate at Fastly, and is also a community and ecosystem builder as well as an educator. Also a Morehouse alum. I just have to shout that out just because, you know, goes deep. And then we also have Vince Greer, who's the Associate Dean of Students for DEI and Residential Life at Claremont McKenna College. So welcome, and so glad to have each of you here this afternoon. So what we'll do is, and we'll start with you, Catherine, if that's okay. We'll just start, if you could just give us a 1 to 2 minute background on you and your experience within the tech ecosystem.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So again, Catherine Brown. I began my career working in education, worked at TFA, and that was when I first started to get my interest in experiences working in digital transformation. So hopped around quite a bit, eventually ended up at business school at Columbia, and from there made the transition into the tech industry more formally. I've worn a lot of different hats. I've done some organizing. I was a teacher at one point, as I mentioned. I've worked as a data analyst. I have also spent time in the startup space as well. So I currently work at Adobe, where I focus on organizational design and digital transformation formally. And that's just a fancy way of saying that I help companies think about the people side of digital transformation, which is often neglected. And so thinking about D&I and the conversation that we'll have today is a natural part of everything that I do. You can design the perfect team, but if you don't have the right people in the room, if you don't have the right people empowered, it's not going to be effective. The other thing that I would just call out in this introduction is, as I mentioned, I've worn quite a few different hats and have jumped around a bit in my career, although digital transformation has certainly been an overarching thing that ties it all together. But I have the type of resume that may not make it through some hiring algorithms. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion, but I just want to call that out.
And then we'll go to Lindsay, Vince, and Maurice.
Great. Thanks so much, Tyler, L, Cole, and the team for inviting me to be a part of this panelist. Again, my name is Lindsay Heiser. I am the Philanthropy Program Manager at Snap Inc. My career actually started early on in marketing, which I think afforded me the opportunity to really understand consumers and how you create community. From there, actually, with a co-founder of mine, launched a tech startup, and that was kind of my first journey into entrepreneurship and all things tech. It was the early days of what we like to call Silicon Beach here in LA, and navigating that as not only a woman, but a Black woman, and trying to raise money, build a team, and scale a product. From there, did some consulting around branding and marketing, working specifically with underrepresented founders. That led me to my next move to the LA Area Chamber of Commerce and Bixel Exchange, which first started in advising other startups through their startup launch program. And then quickly, through my long lineage and family, I got roped into education and was working really closely with connecting diverse talent in LA to tech opportunities. One of our biggest partners was Snap, and so worked really closely with my now team to help build out a number of different initiatives of being able to provide exposure and access to tech companies, whether that be Snap, Hulu, Nike, Boingo Wireless, and so on and so forth. In the last 3+ months, I joined the Snap team to really oversee our philanthropic efforts. Our pillars are really focused on youth, arts, and education, and how we're able to provide volunteer engagement opportunities for our Snap team members. And most specifically, when I joined, COVID was already underway, and so I've been working remotely for my first 3 months. So that's been really interesting, and I think that also is a testament to how we kind of build teams and inclusivity, which I know that we'll jump into. And just excited to be a part of today's conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vince Greer, Associate Dean of Students for Diversity, Inclusion, and Residential Life at Claremont McKenna. My pronouns are he, him, his. Really want to thank Elle, Tyler, and Cole for the opportunity to be a part of the panel. And just a little bit about my story and background. I'm originally from the south side of Chicago. I've been in education, higher education, my entire career. So I've had stints at DePaul University, Brown University, Northeastern, and most recently for the last 4 years at Claremont McKenna College here in Claremont, California, not too far down the road from LA. What I'll say is my sort of tilt is a little bit more unique, if you will. I see my role and how I connect with the panel today is really helping to foster student leaders for generations within tech in a various range of different fields. A lot of times, particularly with DEI work and at Claremont McKenna, we were a little late on the train, if you will. I've been a part of a center that I actually built from the ground up when I started, and just seeing how DEI has really impacted positively the experience in the broader community, not only at Claremont McKenna, but the larger Claremont colleges, really shows the importance of this sort of work. And I think now we're seeing in recent weeks or months, I should say, within the last month or so, these sort of broader issues around DEI, where, you know, this sort of thing, for me at least, has been at the forefront of the work that I do from day to day. But it's really refreshing to sort of see it become a national an international conversation, if you will. So again, I come at it a little bit more non-traditionally, but really excited to sort of offer some different perspectives on the matter and answer any sort of specific questions as it relates to higher ed and student affairs.
All right, I think I'm last. My name is Maurice Wilkins. I lead inclusion and diversity at a Bay Area tech company called Fastly. Very similar to a few of the other folks on the call. I started my career in education, particularly working with young people committed to the juvenile justice system. And what I quickly realized is that doing that work is hard. And it is even more daunting than inclusion and diversity work in tech. You know, what I realize is that you tell people, you sell this dream that if you do X, Y, Z, that you'll be able to sort of realize some form of the American dream. And what you really know and learn is that no matter what you do, because of the way in which systems work and operate and permeate throughout much of our existence, it's really hard to break through that. And there are outliers, but the reality is that is not the case for most folks. And I was tired of being broke. So I made a transition from education into tech, moved across the country to Redwood City, the worst decision I could have ever made in my life. I hated it. I hated Redwood City. I hated my company. I hated everything about it. But part of why I'm sharing that is the way in which even the system of the thing that we call tech is designed in a way that doesn't have me as at the center of conversations, the way in which we design it, why we design it, where we put the things, we put them, all that stuff. None of those things take in consideration of how that affects marginalized folks. And so I started my tech career in sales, also hated that. But what I saw was there was an opportunity to really influence how you do the work, how you think about the people who are most impacted, how you design for the folks in the fringes. And so I went out to try to get a diversity and inclusion job. No one wanted to hire me. But as Tyler said, Morehouse runs deep. And so I had a friend at this place called the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. After hundreds of applications, no one would hire me, but I had a friend. And we connected one day. 6 months later, you know, long story short, I went from not working in diversity and inclusion to leading diversity and inclusion at one of the biggest philanthropies in the world. Did that for 2 years. And now I left there about a year ago and have been at Fastly for the past year, building an inclusion and diversity program from scratch, thinking about how do you build that in a comprehensive way. Outside of work, I am an organizer for an initiative that is directly responding to what's happening to Black people at this moment. called Black Tech for Black Lives. So really thinking about what now is our responsibility, particularly as tech folks who have a bunch of privilege, access, and resources. What do we do to ensure that we hold both our companies accountable, but also like to not be complicit with the fact that, yes, we have this privilege and yes, we're Black, but we aren't doing enough for the folks who are risking their bodies every day. And so what do we do with our privilege in a way that allows for us to amplify and uplift the work that those folks are doing? And with that, I will be quiet.
Incredible. So glad to have each one of you because your perspectives and knowledge and expertise will be greatly utilized in our discussion today. And so it's so many, you all in your backgrounds, I think is one thing that's very beautiful is that you all were teachers or a part of the education system. And so you can never have enough teachers. And I'm so glad that we have people who understand the pedagogy and the aspect of what it's like to be in the classroom, because a lot of that ends up trickling down throughout the rest of our lives. And so there was a point that was brought up, especially around the tech community and its purpose with DEI. And so I'd love to start with you, Maurice. We'll pick back up with you. You know, given your experiences and the collective panel experiences, what are some of the misconceptions that people have about DEI? And how do you think that we start to address some of those misconceptions? Excuse me.
For sure. So my internet is somewhat unstable. So if it starts to break up, please let me know and I will turn my camera off. But I think there are a bunch of misconceptions. I think part of it is like there's three things that come to my mind. One is folks think, oh, if I hire a chief diversity officer or someone to lead diversity and inclusion, that they're no longer a racist company. One. Two, that if they focus on diversity and inclusion and particularly say, oh, we only want to focus on the women, that is going to solve a problem. Usually it just becomes a proxy for solving problems for white women. And then three, I think it's the reality of the work is that it has to be comprehensive in nature. It has to be deep-seated and rooted in comprehensive strategy. But more importantly than a comprehensive strategy, it's really about like, how do you ensure that you're integrating the work across work streams? So it can't just be diversity and inclusion in this corner in HR that kind of does an unconscious bias training and, you know, a few other things and thinks, oh yeah, we built something. It should be incorporated into how you build product. It should be incorporated into like finance meetings. It should be incorporated into all the aspects of the company that you touch. Like the fact of the matter is, if inclusion and diversity isn't a part of those conversations, if the folks who are leading that work don't have access to the folks who are making decisions, it'll often just become a set of like activities that you do that sort of check boxes and don't actually move the work forward. And then the last thing I'll say, folks often want to make diversity and inclusion just like this fluffy thing. It can have science to it. It can have data. You can use data to be able to make informed decisions, so long as you actively are capturing the right things and right ways to capture the information that you're looking for.
Okay, yeah, just to jump in, I think one thing that Maurice is starting to get at is that diversity and inclusion efforts are not going to be effective unless there's real power behind them. I think power can come in a lot of different forms. Power can be accountability. Power can be linking these efforts to compensation on the managerial level. I think a lot of times when we have these types of conversations, we go all around the world and it's like, it's not that hard. So if I think about spaces that I've been in, if you tie how much bonus someone is going to get to the ways that they're meeting whatever you've outlined as a part of your diversity and inclusion program, you're going to get a different type of energy. If you're holding managers at every single level accountable, again, for whatever targets or KPIs you put in place, you're going to get a different level of accountability. I think the other thing that I would say is a misconception for me is that this is some sort of like that it's just a social or moral cause. So I feel very strongly that it is a social and moral cause, but it's also a a business imperative. I mean, I feel like companies are not going to keep up if they don't start to take this more seriously, quite frankly. And there's been a number of studies. The one that immediately comes to mind is a study that McKinsey put out in 2018 that directly links diversity and inclusion efforts to financial performance over time. So this is no longer a nice to have. It's no longer something to do to get the Black people to be quiet. It is also a business imperative. And I think that's another misconception. And then the last thing I'll say before I pass it off to the next person is that I think there's oftentimes too much of a focus on diversity and not enough focus on inclusion. And that it's back at the idea of it being something performative.
To your point, Catherine, very spot on. I would say from my perspective, a couple of things in regards to misconceptions. First of all, there's a shared investment. I think DEI work is optimal when everyone has a connection one way or another within the work. And oftentimes I've seen over the years where the specialists or the folks that are more geared to do the work are the ones that are saddled with much of the issues, even if they're more than likely not the folks that are causing a lot of the issues or problems. So I think first of all is finding a way, an entry point into the work. And that's going to look different for everyone within different departments and ranges, but that shared investment is key to start out. Furthermore, a lot of times when I see over the course of my career, I've seen folks that don't always take DEI as serious or maybe sort of downplay it or see it as very much to the point that Catherine made, a more of a moral imperative, if you will. And while that's an element, certainly as part of it, is so much more to it. And we're working with people, right? In different aspects, one way or another. And so we should have a better understanding of the various different identities and experiences. And the worst thing that we can do it a lot of times in these situations is, oh, we're all one human race, or, I don't see color, these sort of things where it sort of undermines the uniqueness of identities and experiences. And so I try to pivot that and shift that where we can celebrate the various aspects and experiences, and also challenge our own sort of personal biases and connections to the work. But a lot of times it's that entry point where, you can't even sort of get over the hump until you have folks see their sort of connection and involvement with it. And to sort of close out, I use this example a lot. When I'm doing work with male identified individuals, for instance, and there are specific issues that are more gender specific, I'll find that sometimes male identified individuals will say, oh, well, that's a woman's issue or something of that line. And that is totally the opposite of the work. The reality is the folks that perpetuate many times are the folks from the dominant groups. And so we have to have a shared investment in that and not just sort of see it as oh, that's a race thing, oh, that's for people of color. No, it's for everyone. So I'll pause right there.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pick up off of that. Again, kudos to putting this panel together because I echo everyone's sentiments and it's hard to be the last one in the group to go. But I think one of the biggest things is that even getting out of, like, when you think about diversity of even expanding your thinking, that it's not just gender or race that goes into that. A big piece of it is like really being able to have different folks from different backgrounds because of the creativity and the diversity of thought that they're able to bring. Those lived experiences all help contribute ultimately to your company. As Catherine mentioned too, it then ultimately trickles down and contributes to your bottom line. Oftentimes we're talking from a business standpoint and thinking about, how are we able to continue to operate and make money for the business? Being able to have a diverse and inclusive company is extremely important and statistically shows how that's tied in. I think the other big piece of it is that it has to be something that's rooted throughout the company. DEI cannot just sit within the DEI team or the chief diversity officer down to the coordinator. In my opinion, it starts at the top, trickles all the way down to the bottom, and then the bottom back up. And the important piece of the bottom back up too is that if we look at the structures of how companies typically are as of today, is that the more diverse team members tend to be in more entry or mid-level roles with growth to more executive roles. And so it's important to be able to create also those safe spaces to be able to have conversations of what's working, where are the challenges or the issues, and then being able to lift those up with action plans. And those action plans can be conversations, but they have to, in my opinion, again, hold action. And so action looks like accountability. So which executive is overseeing this and will be measured based upon performance at the end of the year to be able to say that their team met certain metrics. Those metrics can be anything from when you think about hiring, what are the differences between how is your team made inclusive job descriptions? How have you provided professional development or upward mobility? When it looks into something around content, what does it look like around having diverse creators, whether that's behind the camera or in front of the camera? When it looks into being able to talk about, from a technology standpoint, how are we making sure that the tech, especially as like we are at the forefront of like artificial intelligence, is being able to be inclusive of all people. So there's a lot of different elements like within the company. And I think, Maurice, you touched upon this, is that it fully needs to be integrated within every aspect of the company to really be able to engulf and truly be inclusive from that standpoint.
Awesome. I mean, each of you hit on some really incredible points. And I think if I may sum it up correctly, one of the things that each of you are saying is every person in the company needs to take the role of a diversity officer. Like that's everyone's job, is something that I'm hearing. And thank you, Lindsay, because I think you answered one of the Jeremys that are in the room's questions around some of the metrics that can be used. And also shout out to the second Jeremy. Yes, disabilities are a part of inclusion. And we'll definitely get into inclusion, because I think a lot of people stop on diversity and don't really dive into the equity and inclusion parts. And so we will, if time allows, dive into that. But Lindsay, I want to pick up with something that you just said, because it's one of the questions that we got from our attendees today. And it's one that always makes me cringe and or smile, just from my experience as a head of talent for a company. It's just like, how do people find Black and brown talent? Like, I feel like that's a question that we've all heard and all are just like, oh my goodness, this is interesting. But could we provide some guidance to our attendees who may be struggling with solving this challenge? And we'll go Lindsay, and then Maurice, and then Vince and Catherine, if you all want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm with you. I don't know that I smile when I hear that question anymore. I think it's actually cringeworthy, especially with us living in Los Angeles. And I'll say that specifically since this is LA-TechOrg, of being a part of the community. I mean, like what you just mentioned is that it's every single person in the company's responsibility to be inclusive. And so just simply being a part of the community. And I understand that not everybody is in the same spaces or sharing the spaces, but I mean, there's amazing organizations that are doing work throughout Los Angeles to be able to educate, train, and provide access for young people. And so, I mean, like a first step there is like, how do you get involved with, call it like LAUSD, right? Like, let's just look at like the breakdown of the numbers of the students of like that make up Los Angeles. Like if we just wanted to go on like the macro level, then from there are a number of different organizations like the one that I was with before, Bixel Exchange, Unite LA, who you all are with now, that are have purposely developed programs for underrepresented talent to get into tech. Then if we even look on like a larger level than there, I think that there are specific training programs and boot camps that go across the board. There's ones that are serving opportunity youth, like the Opportunity Youth Collaborative. There's ones that are serving just Black men, like Hidden Genius Project. There's ones that are serving Black and brown, like Urban TXT, Code 2040. I mean, especially with Google, like at our fingertips of just doing a little bit of research and having some intentionality around it and wanting. I think that that's the big thing, is that there's a little element of laziness, in my opinion, that exists where it's like, oh, we can't find anybody. But it's like, have you done the work? Have you reached out? Have you reached out to a Black person? Have you reached out to a Latinx person to ask like the different types of groups that they're a part of? Especially now with this conversation being at the forefront, every day there's a new group that's popping up that I see that's speaking directly to me because I am a Black woman in tech. But then like I think about that of like, again, a Google search could help you find that information as well. So I think it's a few things of like, one, having the intentionality around it, identifying different organizations, thinking about where the groups of talent you're looking for, because a number of the organizations I mentioned were for entry level. But then if you look at kind of mid-level, there's color comms, there's Afrotech, there are organizations that exist. And then even if like you go up to the executive level, you look at things like Blacks in Tech or the Executive Leadership Committee that are all out there that are serving this purpose, because we know, again, that being able to have a diverse team helps the company overall. So there are specific initiatives helping to support this.
Yeah, there's not a lot to say as far as like actual organizations. I think the thing that I'll highlight here is it's really important to also, while you're doing like the work to sort of figure out like how you get more Black and brown folks to come to your organization, that you also do an inventory of like, what are the things that are in place that are systematically designed to exclude folks. So when you think about the interview process, do you have a standardized process? Is the way in which you are assessing talent like clear and and you walk into whatever the process is with an understanding of that? Is there a diverse group of people who are interviewing those folks? Have you defined what the bar is? A lot of people want to say that they don't want to lower the bar, but have you actually defined what that means? What are the skills that need to exist in order to do that? And then moving past recruiting, thinking about the ways in which your company like structure, the way in which your company's policies and procedures exist to uphold like the places where folks won't feel comfortable either way. And so you could do whatever, like a bunch of things to sort of recruit and like make it attractive on the front end. But if you're not building an inclusive culture, you're not thinking about the ways in which you have to like reevaluate the culture that you're building, folks may come and then absolutely hate it and leave. And so in order to really, I think about this work, and once again, one can't sit without the other. Inclusion and diversity are things that have to exist together. I'm not going to include equity because I think most companies are not doing even touching what equity means, because that requires a bunch of restructuring that most of us aren't ready for. But I think it's really at the core, it's about thinking about the ways in which you build a community and a space for folks, and listening to the people that you have in the space and hear them out first before you try to bring a bunch of more folks into the space. Because 9 times out of 10, the folks that you have there either have a bunch to say in a way that doesn't like without you like sort of like, oh, you're Black, tell me what I should be doing. More like, I recognize your opinion, I recognize that the work that you do here is valuable. We want to be able to figure out how to reimagine the space that we're building, include folks in that, and have those conversations and be honest about sort of where you are and not pretend like none of these things exist. I think it's probably some of the first steps.
I'll be brief. I think Lindsay and Maurice touched on a lot of the major points that I was looking to make. I will say, unpacking the notion of culture and fit, a lot of times those are veiled or loaded terms. And usually what I've seen in my experience is the folks that are usually invited within a culture or fit are usually folks that look or share similar experiences as the general makeup of a team or an environment. And so if you want different talent, you need to be able to expand and look at it from some different perspectives and go some different ways. And very much to Maurice's point around retention, there's always a lot of effort that's placed on the outreach and getting folks there, but actually retaining talent requires to hear their experience, requires not to be thin-skinned, and truly have an open mind, because that's the only way you're going to be able to expand that reach. If you realize that, hey, maybe we're not doing everything the most optimal way, or there are some different ways we can go about this. And so I would just sort of challenge that notion from within a company. So your hiring teams, committees, the folks that are making decision-making, talent, scouts, and all those sort of things, like ensuring that there's a diverse team around, and also being able to look at some non-traditional ways. If you have a traditional approach with your pipeline, you're going to get the same sort of talent that you're seeing in and out.
I think it's on me. Just to jump in really quickly, I wanted to address a comment that was made. So I don't think it's so much about vilification. I think there just needs to be an acknowledgement that when we think of tech, we think of an industry and we think of companies that are supposed to be innovative. I think across the board, tech and beyond, there's a lot of room to think more creatively about where we find talent. There's a lot of things that come to mind for me. I think about all of the innovation that's happening around digital strategy that's driven by Black teenagers on Twitter. I mean, there's just a lot of room to think about what we value and how we find people outside of the traditional formal structures. The other thing that I would offer up just tactically, an organization called MLT is a great place, Management Leaders for Tomorrow. It's an organization I was a part of. And so I would just look that up as in one organization to look up. The other thing, particularly for entry-level positions that I found to be most effective is working with Black student organizations on campuses. So just reaching out to the president of those organizations directly. And then the last thing I would say that ties into both of those is don't underestimate the extent to which these diverse candidates or people that you're seeking are very networked. We talk to each other, we know each other, and organizations develop reputations. And so I think the more work you do in this space, the easier it becomes, for lack of a better way of putting it. So just don't ever underestimate the conversations that are happening offline as well.
No, thank you. Thank you for these. And also shout out to everyone who is writing, asking questions, putting things in our chat. We are getting to them. Lindsay just dropped some resources that we will follow up with you in the email, but take advantage of it now while it's right here. These are all great resources. And so I'm just reading through a couple of the comments, and definitely we'll get to those, but I want to go up back to Kiana's. She had a question about, her statement was, one thing I would say is that we have tons of experienced Black and brown professionals that need no special training. They can fit the roles today. How do those individuals get hired? And so I would love, Vince, if you would start there. I would just love to hear your thoughts on what can companies do right now to get the individuals who are qualified hired. And I want to couple that in with a question that we had submitted by an attendee before today, was just, how can we change the term culture fit in tech to be more inclusive? And I know you addressed that in your statement, but if you could dive deeper, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of go back to this notion of culture fit, I see that as a catch-all a lot of times, or at the very least, a justification for hiring folks that typically have a similar background or experience. And to the point that was raised, when we're talking about innovation and thinking outside of the box, especially in the year 2020, where there's just so many different resources out there and at our fingertips, I think a lot about social media, and to the point that was made, I think it was Catherine just a moment ago, around Black Twitter, for instance, or TikTok, and these various forms of just unique engagement in terms of folks from people of color across the board. And so what I would say is that we have to start first looking within our company, think about what are the goals for the company. Are we content with our current makeup and just adding one or two folks of color to say, check, we're a little bit more diverse? Or are we really looking intrinsically at how we can do this work and make it a more inclusive environment? I think about even intersectional identities beyond just race and gender, for instance, the point that was raised around ability and religion. There are a lot of sort of markers. When those issues are being brought up within an organization, for instance, how do we respond to that? Are we just so focused on the bottom line that we're not taking into account some of those individual experiences and how that contributes to a person likely to retain at a company and want to be there. So there's a lot of those sort of questions where if you're only going to have one or two people that's within your company, you're not likely going to be able to hear the accurate perspective, because most people aren't going to be willing to put themselves out on the line to share their authentic feelings with fear of retribution, being fired, and those sort of things. And so, so part of it is looking at the makeup of your company, identifying folks that at the top from a leadership standpoint that are going to make a true commitment. And I love that what's going on in the world right now, because and it goes beyond the hollow statements, because I see these statements that come out and it's like, okay, whatever, but true actions that are being put behind that. So if you're going to make a declaration as an organization or a company that we're going to commit to this and this, have the follow through with that. And that starts with the leadership. And then when you're getting to those hiring processes, make sure that those things are still a part of that. But you need accountability, you need transparency. For instance, a lot of times this work happens behind the scenes if it's happening, but there aren't a lot of times a lot of updates that are going on. So it's hard to really get a feel of a company fully unless you're sharing a little bit more about those things, and not in a performative matter, but truly from a place of, hey, this is growth. Maybe we haven't always gotten this right, but we recognize now this is a turning point. And so it's a lot of those sort of things. But if it's just like, oh, we need to placate, our Black and brown folks in the moment, and so things calm back down, and then we're back to business as usual, you're not going to shift as a company. So it's a lot of introspection, I would say.
And if any, Maurice, Lindsay, Catherine, if any of you all want to chime in and add on.
Yeah, I can jump in really quickly. Just picking up on the thread of transparency, one of my favorite quotes of all time, because I'm such a nerd, is you can't manage what you can't measure. So I come from a data background. Break it down. You can look and see how many people applied, how many people were interviewed, and how many people were actually hired, and do analysis to figure out where's the drop-off point and why is it happening. The other thing that I would say is that what I find in the work that I do day to day, beyond diversity and inclusion, just thinking about organizations writ large, there is oftentimes a disconnect between what's happening at an executive level, what's messaged at a company level, and what's actually translated throughout the organization. So I would just say, think about who actually has the hiring power. So I've done a lot of work at companies that I worked at to interview candidates, to go to HBCUs and do this, that, and the other. But then ultimately the person that decides yes or no is someone that's not held accountable to whatever the initial program was that I was a part of. So I think thinking about, just to wrap it up, thinking about how do you increase transparency as was already mentioned, and how do you also just break it down and figure out where the disconnect is actually occurring.
Can I add just one last quick point with that? Be okay with potentially failing a search if it comes to it, right? If you don't realize that you have a diverse candidate pool, are you willing to go back to the drawing board? So is it just so important that you make the hire that doesn't matter? Because at that level of investment, that puts the onus truly on the company to make a change. So I know that that's not something that most companies are willing to do, but if you're really, really invested in this and your pool isn't making up, the makeup of that pool isn't where you want it to be, you have to be willing to go back to the drawing boards.
Awesome, thank you. And I also want to, pose a question to Catherine, just given your work and your expertise in this, and I'll share the question out to the audience. And so it's, would you have any thoughts that you could share with me about how white women can aggressively drive diversity, equity, and inclusion in an elitist, male-dominated, and non-diverse environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably what I would say is that, and I don't know who mentioned it, but a lot of times when we think about diversity and inclusion and who's historically benefited from those efforts, it has often been white women. And that means a few things. It means, one, that there are oftentimes greater numbers of white women. So I think of ways that white women can leverage the power that they've already gotten. And so in organizations that I've been a part of, there's been, for example, a lot of focus on gender parity, a lot of focus on gender equity throughout the organization. And so if you're having conversations about gender, how can you also tie in conversations around sexuality or race or disability or whatever it is, I think is one thing I would say. And then the other thing I would say is that, and this is just speaking more to one of my personal experiences. So I have been an advocate of certain things within organization, and I've really appreciated the ways that white women have amplified the efforts that I'm already doing. And I think there's a larger conversation probably at play around power and intersectionality and how we all enter into these spaces. But I guess what I'm driving at with that is thinking about what are the ways and things that people are already doing throughout the organization that you can put more power behind, particularly if you're someone that's operating at an executive level, because I can almost guarantee that that is happening, and there are probably employees that would really appreciate that sort of partnership. So those are things that initially come to mind off the top of my head. If I think of anything else, I'll jump back in.
And if any of our other panelists would like to jump in, Lindsay.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say, I think also that now is the time to also do that, right? Is that it's no longer the conversation of, oh, I didn't know or I wasn't aware. And so even if you don't feel maybe you're kind of testing the waters to understand, like, well, how are people in the company going to respond to this? I think you can use current events to be able to bring the conversation up and be able to have a healthy dialogue about it, and then start to translate that conversation again to action of, like, well, what can we do? How can we hold ourselves accountable and be willing? Like, I love like what Vince had shared of like being willing to like understand that like you might not get it right every single time, but it's like taking that effort to move it forward to be able to see some results that will come. Because even if like your initial goal is maybe not met, there will be other things that happen along the way that will be positive drivers to kind of continue to move the conversation and the change forward.
Awesome. And we have some great questions that are coming in. And so I would love to start with Eric. He asked one. And so Maurice, I'd love to hear from you on this. Generally, too much diversity leads to chaos. Too little diversity limits innovation. So like most things in life, there's a balance point between the extremes. How do we find the right balance of diversity within a company?
I would say that I haven't seen a place that has sort of modeled too much diversity. So I don't have a data point, and maybe they exist, but in the world in which I exist in, especially the one around tech, especially tech in the Valley, that's not the case. Because what happens is, especially when you think about like for diversity, like we all bring a variety of different identifiers and that intersect with one another. And so I would say it's hard for me to answer the piece around too much diversity. What I will say is, when thinking about balance, I mean, it's about ensuring that even if we aspire for demographics that of the United States, for example, so if we're saying that Black folks represent 15% or 13% of your company's population, Asian folks around the same, and Latinx folks similarly, if we're just thinking about race and ethnicity, is it complete balance? No, but it does give us an aspirational place to go. So I would say, I think it's about making sure that there is some balance. If your team is all men, thinking about like how do you bring some gender balance there. If your team is maybe all women, like making sure that there is, you're thinking about it in a variety of different ways. And then the other piece I would say is thinking about intersectionality is really important. So thinking about what are the other things that people bring to the table and bring to the conversation that allow for us to ensure that a variety of identities are represented, a variety of voices are present at the table. So I mean, that question is a little difficult for me to answer, but I think it's about thinking about what are your teams missing, and working to bring those voices, highlight those voices, and give space for those perspectives that don't exist there yet.
Nice. Thank you for that, Maurice. Oh, Vince, go ahead.
Really quick, I was just going to say, and depending on the makeup of your team, it's not like you're going to suddenly clear house on half your team to make sure that, it's way more equitable in one way or another. But a lot of it is within that environment, making it a culturally competent environment to when you get more folks in. So for instance, what are you doing on a consistent basis around training around these issues? Is it a sort of one-off thing and then we're done for the year? Because if you're fostering an environment that feels inclusive, when more opportunities and positions open up, it feels like a more inclusive environment versus, makeup is one thing and that is very important. But again, like when we're talking about a culture and trying to shift it, there's a lot of work that needs to happen within a team even before you start to make that shift in terms of a makeup.
Awesome. Thank you, Vince and Maurice, for those. And I think it pairs very well into another question we have from the audience. And I'll also share, just to build off of your points, as we think of a city as diverse as Los Angeles, my personal philosophy is that your company should be exactly how you said, Maurice. It should just be representative of the city at the very least. So whatever those demographics are, that's just like a good North Star. Like for a city of LA to, the Latinx population to be as large, but not be as representative in tech companies, that's like, okay, cool. Clearly the people are here and we know that the talent is here given the amount of universities. So I think that's a good start. And I think
we're in a place like the Bay where Black people make up about 2 to 3% of San Francisco. So I think it's representative, but also like if all else fails, if your city is not one that is, and I know that LA is more diverse than San Francisco in some ways, that's just, I think, another call out to make because it's hard to base off of that if you're in a place like here or Portland, for example.
1000%. Then you go to those US stats. For sure. Thank you, Maurice. And then Binyam, and please accept my apologies if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. He asked, or she asked, how can D&I work? Essentially, diverse hiring, inclusive teams thrive in an ecosystem where startups are pressured from VCs to grow as fast as they can, which often means putting D&I work on the back burner. How do we change the incentive structure so companies start prioritizing D&I from day one? And I think Catherine talked about this earlier with intention. And so I'd love to start with Lindsay for this, given that you've started a company, and then hear from Catherine if she'd like to follow up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One is, and that we've heard this, is being in alignment with your investors of not only the business, but the company that you're trying to create so that there's the sustainability and long-term growth element of it. But I think it goes back to what we were saying before, is that it's not that the talent's not out there. So you can be building these companies from day one, thinking about diverse talent and be able to have great people of color that are leading product, that are leading engineering, that are leading design, comms, marketing, et cetera, and so forth. And so again, I think it goes back to the intentionality around creating the company and knowing that that's your North Star of what you're doing. And if you start that on day one with your early employees, of like them being able to ingrain that in the culture, like this is like what we're looking for, this is how we're growing. I actually think that companies that are starting today probably have more ability to create diverse companies because, again, the resources are out there that are telling you and showing you where diverse talent is, and you're able to build it. It's not like, as Vince said, it's not like, oh, well, where the companies that already have 3, 10, 20,000 employees are going to clear house to try and make this because they have an infrastructure. That's a whole other piece. You have the opportunity to build it from the ground up and be an example from that standpoint. So I would say from there. And then I think, again, I know it's hard when there's money on the table, and you're going into those rooms and it's older white men that have the checkbooks, because that was definitely the case, and definitely felt the difference of energy in the room, of just even going in the difference between having male investors and female investors. But with that, really being able to assess and understand like what you're willing to, like, what are your deal breakers and what are you willing to walk away from? I think that that's something that as a founder, you can kind of hold the power as well and wanting to like be able to build out your company, be in alignment with from investors, board, exec team, mid-management to entry-level talent.
Yep, I think, yeah, that's just spot on. And I was going to say, I think, you know, just kind of going back to the initial premise of the question, it's like, kind of gets at what we're saying. D&I work should not be separate. And there's no world where I'm building a company from the ground up and I'm not prioritizing getting the best minds in the room, that I'm not prioritizing getting the best perspectives in the room. And I just don't see how that can happen without a lot of intentionality around who you're hiring, recruiting, et cetera. Having said that, I don't want to kind of gloss over the fact that there are very real cultural norms in place. We're trying to change systems. We're trying to change ways of working that are hundreds of years old in some instances. So it is going to require changes and belief from people, quite frankly. And the VC industry is very dominated by white men. But I think that's changing. You know, I think about Harlem Capital Ventures. I think about Gen Y Capital Partners. I think about Humble Ventures. Like there are changes that are happening in these spaces. And so kind of to Lindsay's point, as founders, you have power. And you have power to decide who you take money from and who you don't take money from. And again, I don't want to undervalue not even the courage that would require, but you know, it's a business. You're trying to make money. You're trying to get funding. I totally get it. But again, I just want to say, I think it goes back to the belief. You have to believe it. And as someone that works across a lot of different industries and companies and organizations at all different maturity levels, I can say without any hesitation that the most effective companies are diverse, period. And there's a very real competitive advantage, I think, because as Lindsay also mentioned at the end of her answer, you will have more space to do this. You're not going up against an HR system that's been in place for years and years and years. You're designing. So when we talk about innovation and the benefits of innovation, particularly in hiring and recruiting, I actually think it would be a huge competitive advantage if more startups were leaders in that. And it's honestly kind of surprising to me that hasn't already happened.
Thank you. And so I know we're getting close on time, and Elle will cut me off very soon. But so I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that you just said, Catherine, about this time and space that we're in right now, and how there's a lot of work that's being accelerated, but this is a really, really long journey. And so one of the questions that we got, and I would love to have a couple things happen at once. So if our panelists, I know Lindsay, you already dropped some, there's a question just asking for books, tips, and pointers for inclusive job postings, but also any resources that you all would like to share with the collective, that would be incredible. So if you could just drop those in the chat. And then there's a very powerful question that was asked by some of our ambassadors around what steps can an employee begin to take to improve DEI within their workplace without risking their job? And I'd even like to build on that of just like, what are some tips, tools, thoughts that you would give to people of color and allies who may not feel safe in the workplace, and how they can start to bring about their change bring about change regarding DEI without necessarily having to lead. And I'll give you a minute to get your thoughts. And I also just want to acknowledge that it is getting close to the 1 o'clock hour. I know if your calendar's like ours, it's probably something you have coming up. And we just like really want to thank you for your virtual presence, but your energy is very real. Thank you for everyone who asked questions, who participated. We really hope that this was fruitful and useful for you. We will have a series of panels around all topics that aren't just focused on DEI that we want to use so that your company and companies, can be able to grow and blossom. That's what Unite LA and LA-TechOrg are both here for. And also we'll link you to be able to connect with our panelists in a follow-up email. So for the order to answer that question, we'll go Catherine, Vince, Maurice, and then let Lindsay close us out.
And just so I'm clear, the question is about how to advocate internally and
just how to advocate internally. What, if you are a person of color or ally who may be uncomfortable about bringing this up in your company, what can you do? How do you protect your peace? Just something in that realm.
Got it. Yeah, okay. I would say, I think the first thing is being honest with yourself about how far you're willing to go. As Tyler knows, I can have a big mouth sometimes, especially when it comes to these issues, and I've already kind of made peace with the potential consequences of that. So I would say, one, just being incredibly honest with yourself. I think the other thing too is recognizing that there's always strength in numbers. It's easy to single out individuals, but it's much harder to do that with a group. So thinking about how can you work with any employee networks that might already be in place formally, and even beyond that, how can you partner with other employee networks? So if I'm in the Black employee network, how can we partner with the women's network, and kind of so on and so forth. And then also thinking about informal networks as well. Who have you had conversations with that's indicated that they might be an ally or be sympathetic, even though I hate the term that they might be an accomplice, or that they might be sympathetic to whatever it is that you're advocating for. And then the last thing I would say is paying attention to language and initiatives from people in power. So one thing I do a lot, I try to make sure that I pay attention to executive updates and town hall meetings and all of that. And oftentimes, one, people will say things, explicitly, this is important to me, and that's someone that can now provide coverage or again, be a potential amplifier. And then the other thing is, sometimes what you're doing might align on an organizational level, on a business strategy level, with something that someone's pushing that they're not thinking about as a D&I initiative. So that's the other thing I would say too. So trying to figure out what are those connection points between what you're advocating for and things that the organization cares about, and then how can you get as many people as possible behind you. And then the absolute last thing that I would say is, we are at a very unique moment in time. There's a lot of energy around this topic, and I think as individuals, we need to recognize that we have power, even within an organization. Nobody wants to be the next headline right now. And so I think there's the opportunity to be maybe braver than you would have been before, and to really leverage that power, and to think about what are other companies doing that your company is not, and how can you lift that up as well. So I'm not just one employee complaining, I'm letting you know that these other companies over here are doing this and we're not, and people are paying attention. So those are things that I've found to be effective.
Wow, that was really well stated, Catherine. A lot of the things that I wanted to hit at, I would just say, really either appealing to the head or the heart. I mean, for some people, it's going to be the bottom line, or that sort of analytical aspect, or it could be the sort of moral, ethical route as well. Too, I would say the point that I instantly went to is finding influential folks, decision makers in particular, within a company that align with your values. Because a lot of times, whatever that may be, they can amplify those voices, and they have, the levers potentially to make a shift. One other thing I would add too is, if those folks exist, assuming that they do, I'm big on a sort of growth mindset and coach and environment, fostering that sort of environment where we can always continue to grow and expand, and not sort of being complacent where we are. A lot of times, if you're resting on your laurels and don't feel like, oh, this is that big of a deal, or it's not that important, obviously a lot of change isn't going to happen. But if we can sort of engage folks that, hey, this is ongoing work, it's going to require constant innovation and shifting of perspectives, much like anything else. We look back 15 years or so, and cell phones wasn't a thing that it is today now, right? So we can do that as a country, a world, on almost any topic. And this is no different when we're talking about D&I work. But it does certainly start with those sort of powerful players. So if there are influential folks that you built either informal or formal connections with, that you could sort of, partner on, or maybe, slide a little thing in there to start to get the ball rolling, maybe introducing, a book club or whatever it is, those sort of subtle things to get the ball rolling. Hopefully you can sort of build off of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in the sense that, one, this is a human issue, right? And if you're able to connect human to human, one thing that I'm really grateful for is that throughout my career, I've been able to be on really amazing teams and just connect with people. And so in connecting around the work that we're doing, you're able to also connect around the conversations. And so being able to have those conversations, and as both Catherine and Vince have mentioned, you're able to build those allies. And it doesn't matter whether it's me being a Black woman, or it's a white woman or a white man on my team, we're connecting on a human level. And if it affects you, bringing that up. I mean, a lot of times we know that in companies, people will come in and you kind of have your Monday morning stand-up meeting, and people will say, how was the weekend? well, if there's something that's bothering you that happened over the weekend, of like sharing that. And it might be uncomfortable for people, but share that, because then all of a sudden it starts to open up the gates of like, it might have made somebody else uncomfortable, but like they were a little bit afraid to say something. Catherine also touched upon, we are at like an inflection point right now where there is an opportunity to maybe be braver or to step out on something that you may or may not have talked about before, and being able to have that support, find those allies that you can have those safe conversations, and then bubble those up, because it is strength in numbers. The last thing that I will kind of just leave us with is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And I have been saying this and saying this and saying this. And so it's important that I share that with this group as well, because while it's all in the media now, a big piece of it that we can also do, whether it's at our companies or just as consumers of brands, is holding people accountable, right? It's like, what are the different actions that are happening? Because ultimately, like with our dollar, we have power to be able to make shift and changes. And companies are aware of that. And so it's important for us as team members to keep our companies accountable and to push things forward. But then also, if something is not working, is to be able to utilize our voice and our dollar to make those shifts and changes along the way. Because again, it's in the news now, but we need to continue to keep it top of mind. And grateful to be in conversation with everybody for joining today that is taking a vested interest of like continuing to move the conversation forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Elle, I don't know if you have any closing announcements.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody for attending and for being so engaged and, writing in questions. There are a couple of questions that we weren't able to get to, so we will send up a follow-up email to everybody who attended today. Like Tyler said, this is a series. Like Lindsay said, this is a marathon. We will definitely have more conversations to come. We appreciate everybody. Feel free to send us any additional questions to info@LA-TechOrg, and we will absolutely follow up with you guys. Thank you again. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.